And she's going to be addressing sources of bias in randomized trials, but just as a way of introducing Frances, and also how important it is to have the insights and expertise that an epidemiologist can bring to bear when you're thinking about the design and the conduct and the reporting and the interpretation of a randomized controlled trial. My own personal experience, I've been doing trials for about 25 years or so, and we've done about 15 trials, and we've probably, in the context of all of those trials, we've probably randomized about 18,000 people. And some of those trials have been fantastic to work on and actually have been much more rigorous with respect to both their methods, but also just the chance to actually work on something which was really making a fundamental contribution to how patients and people were being treated. And those were all distinguished, and this isn't a causation argument, but those were all distinguished by having top-flight epidemiologists involved, because you have to see trial design and delivery as a collaborative exercise, but it has to be a real collaboration involving the essential disciplines and enthusiasm that you need in order to conduct an important investigation. And epidemiology plays a big role, and Frances is going to say a little bit about that, I hope. Okay.
Thanks, John. And thanks to Declan and to Sandra for the invite to speak. So I'm afraid my talk is not going to be as entertaining, I'd say, but we'll do our best. So first of all, I'm going to talk about bias in randomized controlled trials, and as Martin said, this talk will probably go on for a long time as well, but I'm just going to talk about the definition and then 5 principles to apply when you're designing a randomized controlled trial, or the major principles that are involved. So bias, by its definition, in lay terms, just a prejudice or a predisposition to a particular point of view. And in health terms then, it's a systematic error in the design of a trial that would lead to an erroneous association between exposures and outcomes. And then in RCT terms, we think of it as any factor or process that deviates the results of a trial systematically away from the truth. So there are 22 forms of bias listed up here, and I could probably put another slide with another 22 different names. And this is quite confusing for people when they're entering the area of clinical trials and thinking about conducting clinical trials. But in essence, really, there are 2 main sources of bias in any study, and that's selection bias and measurement bias. So the thing that we're interested in is the systematic error. The random error is something we can do very little about. We'll do our best to ensure our study is randomized, and I'll talk about that in a moment. But you can still get the wrong result even when you have taken care of your systematic bias and ensure that it's not there, because it can occur by chance, or maybe we have a small sample size. So what is selection bias then? It's when there are systematic differences in the way participants are selected for a trial, or also in the way that the treatment is allocated them once they're entered into the trial. So if you're allocated by investigator preferences, or if a patient preferentially prefers one treatment or other, confounding by indication occurs, and you're going to have differences then between the prognostic factors that you're interested in. Just to come back to observational studies and why we're so interested in randomized controlled trials as being important to demonstrate causality, Deeks in 2003 reviewed 69 non-randomized trials and observational studies, and he found that there was overestimation or underestimation of the treatment in each of those studies. So then to come to measurement bias, this is also called information bias, and it occurs when we don't measure what we intend to measure. Classes of it can be observational bias, misclassification bias, recall bias, more common in case control studies, and interviewer bias. So if we take the example of measuring your blood pressure, and we take 3 measurements, and there's little variation, we say that a measurement is very precise. If there's a lot of variation, we say that we have some random error. And assuming then we're measuring the blood pressure under the same conditions and not in some very stressful situation, we assume that any measurement error is random. But if we take the example of blood pressure and we haven't calibrated our machine correctly, and we measure and get incorrect results, then we have systematic bias. And the thing to remember is, unlike random error, systematic error cannot be removed by repeatedly measuring. So I've just said there's two main forms of bias, and now I'm introducing a third one, so I'm almost contradicting myself. But ascertainment bias is something that comes up in clinical trial literature and medical literature in general. And that again comes back to terminology. Now, I'm sure the statisticians will eat me when I say it's a type of sampling bias, because there's disagreement out there in the literature as to whether this is the case or not. But essentially, it's when the results or conclusions of a trial, again, are systematically distorted by knowledge of the treatment that's received. And in terms of thinking of it, it's like a form of selection bias. But then when you actually look at it, really ascertainment bias can occur at any phase of a clinical trial. It can occur, be introduced by the person administering the trial, by the investigator. It can be occurred it can occur in the write-up of the trial. It can occur in the analysis of the trial. So it can be introduced at any phase of the trial. So how do we minimise ascertainment bias at the different phases? Essentially, that comes down to blinding. And most of us know what blinding is. Martin has already talked about single blind and double blind studies. And essentially that means that in single blind study, generally understood that the participant does not know which intervention they're receiving. Are they receiving the intervention or the controls? They don't know the treatment that they are receiving. Double blind is generally understood to be neither the participant nor the investigator conducting the study knows the treatment allocation. Triple blind would be the participant, the investigator, and the person assessing the results. But again, you know, when you're reading the literature on this, there's no agreement as to definitions for, but it's three different people involved in the study would not know the treatment. So 5 principles then to reduce the chance of a biased conclusion. And the first principle is probably obvious one: use a control group. And just as this is an example from the early 1960s on the technique of gastric freezing in the treatment of duodenal ulcers. So this came into effect as a treatment on the findings of an uncontrolled study of 24 patients, in which the patients found a benefit after 6 weeks of treatment. However, in the late 60s then, a randomised control trial was conducted. Now at the time, the severe cases involved surgery, and they could be potentially fatal, and there was no real good treatment for duodenal ulcers at that time. So in 1969, a randomised control trial was conducted and the results were published. And patients were randomised, 82 patients randomised to receive the gastric freezing and 78 randomised to pretend gastric freezing. And at the end of 6 weeks, both groups found a treatment benefit. But after 2 years of follow-up, both groups became clinically worse. So in actual fact, there was never a significant difference between the two groups at the beginning or the end of the study, and this promptly ended the freezing as a method of treatment for duodenal ulcers, but based on the randomised control trial. The second principle is that of blinding, and I'm going to use an example from a multiple sclerosis trial, which is a placebo-controlled trial of cyclophosphamide and plasma exchange in MS patients. So group 1 were allocated IV cyclophosphamide and steroids. Group 2 were given weekly plasma exchange, oral cyclophosphamide and steroids again, and group 3 got a sham plasma and placebo medications. So in this trial, the outcomes were examined by neurologists that were blinded and neurologists that were unblinded. And what was found was the unblinded neurologist scores demonstrated an apparent treatment benefit at 6, 12 and 24 months for the group 2 patients. And this was not found for the blinded neurologists. Okay. So what are the potential benefits of blinding then? There's benefits for the participants. They're less likely to have a biased psychological effect, as we saw in the freezing of the duodenal ulcers. They're more likely to comply with the trial regimens and less likely to seek other interventions. For the investigators, they're less likely to put their views or their impressions across on the patient. They're less likely to withdraw patients or less likely to want patients to receive one or other treatment when they don't know what the treatment is. And they're less likely to have, the assessors are less likely to have bias or outcome, particularly when they're subjective outcomes. So the third principle is that of randomisation. And what we mean by randomisation, random allocation, meaning every participant has an equal chance of being assigned to the intervention or to the control groups. What purpose is served by random allocation? Well, we want the covariates to be equally distributed across the groups at baseline. But of course, this is not always possible, particularly if the groups are small. And I'm sure John or Erica will talk about different randomisation methods that can be used to account for that. It affects the measured variables, but very importantly, it also affects the unmeasured variables. And Table 1 in most randomised trials demonstrate this. They look at the baseline characteristics of the patients in both groups, and they show us this together with p-values. And there's a general assumption, when we look at the p-values, that we have a valid study then, but of course this is not always the case. To know that a study is valid, we really need to look back at the method section and read the method section of a trial very thoroughly, and only then can we get an understanding as to how valid the study is. And that comes down to good reporting, which I'll talk about at the end. So how do we achieve randomisation? Well, there are two different steps involved. The first is the generation of the allocation sequence, and the second is the implementation of the allocation. And I've just put up here an image of two articles from the epidemiology series of Schultz and Grimes in The Lancet in 2002. If you are interested in reading it, these talk specifically about allocation sequences, but if you're interested in reading a little bit more on randomised trials, even though they're quite old, they're still very good readings. So the generation of the allocation sequence, I'm going to skip past the slide because I'm confident Erica will be talking about that after the break, but these are the various different randomisation processes. But the concealment of allocation, let's talk about that one a little bit more. So if making the decision about concealment of allocation is unconcealed, or it's left up to the investigator or to the patient, that potentially they could enrol sicker or better health patients in one or either of those groups. And this defeats, of course, the purpose of randomisation. So after you randomise the patients, you have to conceal the allocation as well. It can't be known. It's great once you have the randomisation scheme. It does not guard against bias. You still have to go the step further and conceal the allocation. So if we take an example, if we have a randomised control trial to use support stockings to avoid deep vein thrombosis. So the patients are randomised to receive either the stockings or to receive no stockings. And the next patient who comes up for randomisation is incontinent. Now, even though the patient's been randomised, the nurse in charge has access to the randomisation scheme, and she decides, well, this patient is definitely not getting stockings tonight because I'm very busy and I'll be changing them 4 or 5 times tonight. And so she subverts the randomisation process. But what she doesn't know at the same time is that incontinence is linked to severity of stroke, and thereby you bias the results of the trial. If we take another example looking at surgery, open versus laparoscopic appendectomy, and this is an example again from the Schultz and Grimes papers. The trial ran very smoothly by day, but at night you had to call the attending surgeon if it was a laparoscopic procedure, and it also was a more lengthy procedure, and there was pressure on the operating theatres. So, reluctant to call more senior colleagues, the residents in charge came up with a new plan, and they decided they'd hold up the envelopes, the randomisation envelopes, to the light and see which patient was going to be allocated next to the laparoscopic appendectomy. And they made sure that the patients at night got the open procedure, and the morning patients then got the laparoscopic procedure. The first patient on in the morning was sure to get that. And of course, what that does is if the patients at night were sicker patients than those in the morning, it would bias against the open procedure. So this is taken from a 2006 article, and this is a meta-analysis of methodological studies. In fact, it's a meta-analysis of 6 meta-analyses. I don't know what you call that, maybe a mega meta-analysis. But looking at adequate allocation concealment or not. And what we're looking at, so it's a forest plot, and this worth the one. So these are the individual relative odds ratios from the 6 meta-analysis, and then this is the combined relative odds ratio. What it shows is that trials without the adequate allocation concealment were approximately 21% more positive. You see the odds of 0.79 there than those with adequate allocation concealment, just demonstrating the importance of that. So what are the different methods that we can use to conceal our allocation? We have SNUs, which are the sequentially numbered envelopes, but of course you need to guard against holding these up to the light and putting some foil in, or perhaps writing the patient's details onto the envelope before it's opened. Sequentially numbered containers ensure they're tamper-proof and they're similar in appearance. And for pharmacy controlled intervention, you have to be very careful and have a very clearly defined protocol for everybody involved in the study, particularly when it comes to concealing the allocation. And central randomisation is probably the best one. Take, for example, a telephone situation where you have to ring, somebody at the other end of the phone will tell you who's next for allocation. But ideally, if that person was not at all involved in the trial, it would be even better. So what's the difference? Martin mentioned this, the difference between concealment of allocation and blinding. So the first is concealment of allocation. It's a procedure to protect randomisation before the subject enters the trial, whereas blinding occurs after the subject enters the trial, and it protects against the treatments that they're going to receive. You can always conceal your allocation, but you can't always blind. So in the example of the surgeries, for instance, if somebody's receiving surgery or not receiving surgery, it's difficult to blind a study like that. We call those open label studies. And if not done, they both lead to bias, selection bias or ascertainment bias, if you want to call it that, for the blinding situation. So for randomisation, just going to look at the Lanarkshire milk trials, which was conducted in 1931. This was a massive undertaking in its time, 20,000 participants, 67 schools, and they were randomised to either feeders, where they got milk, or controls, where they got no supplementation. The milk was either raw or pasteurised, and that's a conversation for another day on cluster randomised control trials. But the teachers selected who participated in each group. Now they did that by either of 2 methods. They either used a ballot method or they did it alphabetically. So this is a quotation from the original paper here. I quite like this one. This is from Biometrica. "So far so good, but after invoking the goddess of chance, they unfortunately wavered in their adherence to her. So everything looked good, but then there was a problem. There seemed to be a lot of well-fed children in one group and malnourished in the other group, and so the teachers decided to substitute the students. And it wouldn't be really fair to have poor children receiving no supplementation, having very well-off children receiving the supplementation. But what happened as a result of this? So this is the height of the boys during the study and the weight of the boys. And this is the height of the girls and the weight of the girls. And the single, the bolded line, or the continuous line, are the control groups. And what actually happened was the controls were heavier and taller than the feeders in the trial. So, of course, this is a problem, and this is a problem particularly in trials in healthcare and in medicine, because it goes against the grain. You're trained as a physician, you help your patients, and you want the best for your patients. So it's very frustrating when you have to say to them, you don't know what treatment you're going to get, and you may not get preferred treatment, or you may have a very sick patient that you want to ensure gets the new treatment because you think it's better. And this, the same thing happened here. The teachers felt it's very unfair that the poorer children are not getting the milk, and so they swapped these children around. So what happens then, of course, is we have the milk supplementation is confounded with poverty, and it biases against the milk supplementation group. as well as that, are in favour of the milk supplementation group, as well as that the children that were lighter, they had more potential to grow, so probably see a greater benefit. In terms of measurement bias, then the trial was conducted in between February and June, and of course you'd have lighter clothes in June, and this wasn't accounted for either. And there was an underestimation of weight gain in both groups, most likely of course in the or less likely in the milk supplementation group. So what should they have done? They should have stuck to their randomisation scheme and everything might have been all right. But once they had done this, could they retrieve the trial? So if they knew the original allocation, they could have analysed by intention to treat analysis. So that's the fourth principle then, analysis by intention to treat. And what does that mean? That means at the start of a trial, we have two groups of patients. But at the end of the trial, they're likely to differ because we have people have dropped out, people may have died, they may have decided they don't want this treatment, they may want to get into the other group, not remain as part of the trial, or maybe remain as part of the trial. So for various different reasons, the groups end up differently. But analysis by intention to treat is analysing them how they started out. So each patient, as they were allocated, is to the treatment or control, or analysed in that fashion, regardless of where they ended up. So if we look at this, taken from the Canadian Medical Association Journal, so this is a randomised control trial of surgery and aspirin versus aspirin alone. It started out with 100 patients in each arm of the trial. 10 got a stroke in the first month in both arms, conveniently, and surgery was conducted after those first 10 had the stroke. Down here, 10 further had a stroke, and 10 further had a stroke even after the surgery. So if we analyse by intention to treat, we're including all 20 of these patients in both arms, because that's how they started out. But if we do what we call a per protocol analysis or on-treatment analysis, analyse them according to the actual treatment that they got, we end up with a different relative risk reduction here, and you can see the variation between the two. But we let it to the statisticians to really delve into what that means. So we know analysis by intention to treat is not free of bias as well, because some participants may receive the other group's treatment. And we know as well that it will make the treatment difference smaller. And as Martin had said, but if you know that and it's still effective, then you're very sure that it's an effective treatment. Per protocol analysis are also biased though, but they're biased in favour of showing a treatment effect, whether there is one or not. So the last principle then is consent before randomisation. I won't delay too much longer. So you want to avoid bias as well. You want to avoid bias by consenting your patients before randomising them. So why would you not want to do that? It's a heavier workload. If you have a multi-arm trial with 4 or 5 different arms and you're the investigator, let's say you're a physician, you have to explain 4 to 5 different treatments to a potential patient, and it's a lot of work. So for that reason, it may suit someone to randomise first, and then you only have one treatment to explain. But of course, that can lead to bias in your trial. So if we take the polio vaccine as an example, so this was in 1954. There were 2 different approaches to allocating children to treat to the vaccination or to the control or the treatment or the control group. The first was the National Foundation for Infantile Paralysis, the NFIP method. And what they wanted to do was all children in second class would get the polio vaccine with parental consent. And in first and third class, they'd act as controls and there was no parental consent. The other, the second approach, then I haven't detailed it there, was what we would call the regular randomised controlled trial approach, where the children were consented by their parents and then they were randomised to either the vaccine or not. What's the problems with the NFIP method? Consenting parents are more likely to be in higher socioeconomic groups, and we know by association they're more likely to be better educated. And school children from high socioeconomic groups are more likely to contract polio. Reason for that being they live in more hygienic conditions and they're less likely to have been exposed to a mild form of the virus while they were still under their mother's antibody protection. So in this instance, by using this method, you bias against the vaccine. And if we look at the results from this does not include the children that were not consented by their parents. But if we look at the results, we have the incidence rates per 100,000 and the sample size in brackets here. We can see there's a treatment effect in both of the arms, but you can see that in fact the NFIP method did bias against the vaccine, and the effect difference is 14 cases per 100,000. So to conclude then, bias can essentially occur through all different stages of the trial, and in preventing it, we can really only learn from history, and many of these examples I've shown you have educated us throughout the years not to repeat those mistakes. One of the problems with that, of course, is that the methods section in a lot of trials papers are not that well reported. And now there are a number of improvements or initiatives to improve the quality of reporting trials. And this is hugely important to how we proceed as a community of researchers, that we can reproduce a trial, we know exactly what has happened, and we can learn from the mistakes. Thank you.